Hi, I'm Julie Levitt-Learson, and this is my lecture on fashions of the Italian Renaissance. And so let's start with some textiles, because the Italian Renaissance is pretty famous for its really rich and sumptuous fabrics. Here are some examples of Italian Renaissance textiles. These are silks. It's a silk velvet with a pomegranate pattern there on the right, and then we have some silk with gold thread woven into stripes. So remember, silk is a Chinese textile. The silkworms are native to China, and the secret to making silk was a Chinese state secret for quite a long time. But somewhere around the 6th century CE, the secret of making silk was smuggled into Byzantium, and Constantinople became a center of silk manufacturing for the Middle East and for Europe. But by the 1300s, Italy had begun weaving silk into textiles. They would import the silk fibers and then in Italy would weave it into cloth. And one of the things that they would weave is a brocade. So brocade it's really richly decorative woven fabric, and it's often made with metallic thread in there, but doesn't have to be. But the word brocade, which funnily enough has the same root as the word broccoli, comes from the Italian word brocato, which means embossed cloth. So you can see the effect is this raised pattern of shape so that it looks embroidered, but it's woven in. And again, this is a technique that was invented in China, and it was embraced by the Byzantine emperors and by Persian entrepreneurs, and then eventually brought to Italy. Of course, that doesn't mean that the only textile that they used was silk. Linen and wool are still very much in use, but here's a surviving linen wool blend textile that has been woven into a kind of diamond floral pattern. But as you can see, it's just not as luxurious as those silks, brocades, and velvets in the earlier slides. And now let's take a look at what they did with these textiles, right? Here's an early Italian Renaissance silhouette. As you can see, it's still covering a lot of the body. Lots of volume, lots of fabric in there, but a less voluminous silhouette than the hoopland from the earlier Gothic period, and generally made of lighter fabrics. And so this vertical line is very much in play here. Let's focus for a moment on some menswear. I don't know if it's fair to call Lorenzo de' Medici a true fashion icon, but he was a prominent figure both politically and economically and culturally in the city of Florence. And so that when you're rich and powerful and famous, you become a trendsetter. So let's start breaking down these layers of a typical Renaissance man outfit. We've got new words for those same 3 layers. So I'm giving you the English word and then the Italian word for it, right? Against the skin, we've got our shirt, or the camicia, on the top, and on the bottom we'll have our linen braise. And I don't actually remember what the Italian word for braise is here. Over the camicia, you'll have what we would call in English the doublet. In Italian, it's the farsetto. And over that, you're going to have a 3rd layer, one of which could be the gunella, which is featured here, right? So the surcoat in English. Over all of that, if you have outerwear, you'll have a cloak or a mantello. You're probably going to wear a hat. And covering your braise on the bottom half of your body, you're going to be wearing the 2-piece hose, or scalza in Italian. And you can see here they've got the points, the laces to tie the hose to the doublet, and then leather shoes on the feet. And we have a few options for that 3rd layer, the outermost layer that isn't strictly outerwear, okay? So the surcoat. You could have a giornia, which is going to be this pleated tabard. It goes over the head, but the sides are open. Or you could have a cioppa, which is, again, pleated, but it's a coat or an overgown, so it's going to be closed down the sides and open down the front, and with sleeves, and sometimes those sleeves are hanging, which we'll get to in a minute. Or you could wear a gunella, which is Italian word for gown, and that's a coat that's not pleated with regular sleeves. In general, the necklines are going to be high in the front, and they're going to curve or have a V shape in the back. And the length of these garments could be anywhere from mid-thigh to just below the knee, Although I would say sometimes the Gunella could go even further. So let's start peeling back those layers. Here are some images of men in their camicia, and you can see it's a shape we're quite familiar with. And here are the different pattern pieces that you would cut out and sew together to make a camicia. As you can see, it is similar to our old friend the tunica, but there are some improvements, right? We've got our rectangle for the front, rectangle for the back, 2 rectangles for the sleeves. We've got these little square gussets in the armpit. And then we have a long skinny rectangle to make a stand-up collar, and then a little triangle in the back to make a yoke. So you can see that slit in the front, right, to make enough room for your head to go in. There'd be a little slit in the back, and then you would sew this triangle gusset into the slit in the back. And what this does is give extra room for your shoulders. I'm going to skip the farsetto layer for now, but I want to get to this third layer, some of our options. So here's a giornea. So you can see here the open sides, right? But it's closed down the front. So it's a tabard and it's held in place with a belt, right? And then you can see that pleating there. Here's another painting example. And then on the left, you can see an existing giornea from the period. So it's kind of like the houppelande with those kind of scalloped prints. And you can see here how the fabric is curved into these, half circles, and then they're stitched together so that those curves stay in place. And then they're stitched onto a ribbon or a cord on the inside to hold them in place. And so the body of the giornea is going to have those pleats, but you're going to see there's a front and a back yoke, that little extra piece at the top, and that's nice and flat so that, up around the neckline you don't have all that bulk that these kind of half circle shapes are going to make. And as you can see from these kind of 4 trapezoids there on the right, that's the cutting pattern. So it's cut straight down the center front and the center back, and then kind of swings out to the side, so you've got more volume at the bottom than you do at the top. And if you lay your fabric out this way, you're going to get the most efficient use out of your textile. Here are some chopo. And you can see, right, so it's similar to the giornea, but it's closed down the side, and it's got sleeves. You could have short sleeves, you could have long sleeves, or you could have these hanging sleeves where, you've got the sleeves sewn into the body of the chopa, and then you've got a slit down the front of it so that your arm can come through it above the elbow or at the elbow, and then the rest of the sleeve just hangs there decoratively. Here's another example of a man wearing a chopa, and when I look at these, I'm kind of reminded of like graduation gowns, right? And you can see the sleeve is kind of roomy, which, given he's holding a bow and arrow, right? So it's probably helpful to get arm motion with that extra room. And here's examples of a Gunella. So similar in shape to that chopa, but without that pleating. So it's a closer fit style, and it's opening down the center front with buttons. It may or may not have a collar, and it's going to have sleeves attached. And as you can see, the length can vary from mid-thigh to mid-calf here. Okay, so now I want to return to that middle layer, the layer that goes outside the camicia, but underneath the Gunella or the chapeau, or the giornea, right? So this is called a farsetto, which is Italy's version of a cotehardie or doublet. It's this middle layer. This is a garment that's going to be really closely fitted to the body with a padded chest and shoulder. It's got a little standing collar that's cut as a separate piece, and it's set into a deep curve at the back of the neck. And then it's 2 pieces. The front and backs are cut in a rectangle or shaped rectangle down to the waist, and then they have like a skirt attached to the bottom edge. And so this makes a very distinct trim waistline. And then there are these eyelets all around the bottom edge for you to run laces through to attach the hose or your scalza to the farsetto. And the trend in sleeves for this garment is that they have a very full kind of puffy upper sleeve and then a very fitted lower sleeve. And this is very Italian. Other places in Europe didn't really do this. And there are going to be lacing points at the shoulder, which originally was for attaching armor, but then they kind of just become ornamental, which you'll just see in a minute. And they may have decorative stitching or quilting, and you might have buttons down the front, or you might have laces or more points again to close that center front. And to be considered properly dressed among high social circles, the farsetto does need to be covered with that other layer, either the Gunella or the Choppa or the Giornea. But, you know, people working at manual labor or soldiers or peasants are probably aren't going to wear anything over their farsetto. So here's a painting of a man in a state of semi-undress. You can kind of see these layers, right? You can see his camicia, you can see his stocking, his scalza, are unlaced and they've fallen down around his knees, but you can see here his farsetto, right, that he's taken his arms out of the sleeves and it's fallen down his back. So the French and English terms for this garment, in English we call it a doublet because it's doubled fabric. There's an inside layer and an outside layer, right? It's fully lined, and in between these two layers would be padding. Originally, this padding was for protection when this is going under armor, and then it just became fashionable. And in French, we would call this same garment a pourpoint because it's for the points. It's for these laces that are going to attach the hose to the doublet or going to attach decorative sleeves on. And over here on the left-hand corner, you can see what I'm talking about. These are the hand-sewn eyelets that would hold the points. So here's an image of some young Italian men in their farsetto, and then there's a giornea over one. And you can see what I mean about these laces kind of being decorative and ornamental. You can see those dangly threads hanging down the arm just above the elbow. But as you can see, this is a snug fitting garment with kind of puffy sleeves, and it's very short. Here is a modern reproduction of a farsetto. You can see that deep V shape in the back that I'm talking about, right, which helps hold the head erect and the shoulders back. You can see that two-piece sleeve. It's kind of puffy on the top and then very narrow below the elbow. And you can see that short hemline on it. And here is pattern pieces for how you would cut this garment out of fabric. So you can see we're well past the draping rectangles around the body. This is a tailored garment. And as you can see, the curved seams on the center front there, the curved seams of the skirt, the kind of wackadoo curves on the sleeves and the collar there, all of that is helping to shape this two-dimensional fabric around a three-dimensional human body. And so we are kind of manipulating the shape of the human body into a fashionable silhouette by using this cutting and tailoring technique. And so we are wasting quite a bit of fabric. As you can see, if we were to lay this out on a piece of fabric, how much fabric is just going to be waste here. So this is kind of a conspicuous consumption garment. Here are more examples of young men in their farsetto. You can see sometimes the sleeves are slit or slashed so that you can see the camicia underneath, and you can see those laces, the points hanging low there. And so you can see in this picture, right, boys playing, so they've taken their outer layer off, and you can see their farsetto. And the farsetto has gotten so short, you can see the hose, and you can see the brays, right? Because remember, our hose are two separate legs without a middle part. The brays are underneath. So we're kind of not leaving a lot of mystery as to what's going on in the human anatomy here. And so to correct that immodesty, we developed this little piece called, in Italian it would be called a brachetta, in English it's called a codpiece. And what this is a little triangular flap of fabric that matches your hose, and you hold it in place, you tie it on with more laces and points, and it's to kind of like join the hose together right at the crotch and cover up any peekaboo of those linen brays. And you can see here's a pattern of how to make a pair, and as you could see in the images above, in the last slide, and in this image right here, the painting is cut off right here. I was trying to get lower, but this is as far as it goes. You can see the codpiece, right, quickly goes from being just this like modesty flap to a rather exaggerated anatomical recreation of what it's supposed to be covering and hiding. Underneath all that, they're still wearing braids. And you can see here's an image of two men in the braids. Now they've gotten quite short and a lot less bulky than the ones from the medieval period, which makes sense. You know, in Italy, it's a bit of a warmer climate. We don't need all these extra layers. And if you're wearing the hose are going to do the work down the legs, so the braids don't need to be covering quite as much. But given how short our farsetto is, even with a ridiculously outrageous codpiece, you better keep things covered. Then for outerwear for men, they're wearing cloaks still. In Italian, this is a mantello. Popular colors in the Renaissance were red and black. And usually there's no visible clasp. So this is a change from like that kind of like Viking, Frankish, Saxon look where there's a giant clasp holding the cloak shut. On Italian cloaks, on the mantello, it's looking invisible. And they may have slits down the sides for the hands or the arms to go through. Sometimes they add these little sleeves, and then I'm like, is it really a cloak anymore? Now it's a robe, but whatever. But lots of times, the mantello is thrown over one shoulder or completely unfastened and just kind of like draped over the shoulders. So it's can be lined in fur if it's winter, most of the time made of wool or sometimes silk. And you can see here, these men on the right, they've got the mantello on. Here's another good image of a mantello, right? And he's got that kind of like fold over, like second tiered on his. But again, right, a lot of variety. So here are some more images of the mantello. The next few slides I don't have a lot to say about. They're just images of men in Italian Renaissance fashion, but just take a look at this silhouette that we've got going on here. It's an overtly masculine silhouette that's showcasing a lithe, trim, athletic figure, right, with a broad chest and strong arms and a narrow waist. And they're in rich fabrics, in sumptuous colors, with detailed embroidery, right? So if the Renaissance is this kind of rebirth of classical ideas, we're celebrating the human body, much the way the Greeks did. Here's another example. Here's another one. It's a bit later. And another. So in contrast, right, this Italian silhouette is a little bit different from what's going on in, say, England. This is a detail from an Italian painting, but these figures in it are the English ambassadors. The one on the left is the English ambassador. So you can see the English ambassador standing next to the guy on the right who's Italian, and there's a little bit of a different sense of self and sense of style going on here. Let's talk a little bit about men's headwear and hairstyles. Remember, Italy is this kind of crossroads between the East and the West, as Europe perceived it. So there's going to be lots of influence from the East, from Persia and from what is now Turkey and from even further east. So, for example, it wouldn't be unusual to see a man in a turban. And this kind of looks a little bit like our chaperone liripeep from our Gothic era, but this is a straight up turban, big old rectangle of cloth that's wound around the head, and the shape is made by the winding. Here's another distinctly Italian fashion, this little fez-like cap called a berretta, and it can have this kind of lip on it, or it can be a little bit more like pillbox shaped. And so you can see hair tends to be long, right? Framing the face around these hats. Doesn't seem to be a lot of facial hair. Here's another kind of hat, a little flat, round, soft cap, sometimes with a brim, sometimes not. A bonnet, right? Looks kind of like a beret. So sometimes there is facial hair, but it's very kind of close to the face and trim. Let's move on to some women's wear. Here's a fashion icon for women's wear, Lucretia Borja. She was the daughter of a pope. Yes, you heard me right. Daughter of a pope. She was married 3 times, had a reputation for potentially killing her husbands, although it probably wasn't her. It was probably her dad and her brother. But she was very wealthy, was reputed to be quite a beauty, and was a patroness of the arts, and in a very powerful and well-connected family. Let's go over our fashion terms for women. Italian women are also going to wear the camicia, right? The linen blouse or the shift. Over that, they're going to wear something called a gamura. And so that's a woman's dress with sleeves. That's like the next layer. It tends to have a fitted bodice, a high waist, and a pretty full pleated skirt. And the sleeves are going to be attached with points like men's, right? So this is informal dress if you're just wearing your camicia and your gamura. And then if you have an overgown, then you're kind of fully formally dressed. So let's talk about those. A cotta, that's kind of the lightweight, the summer version of a gamura. So it's going to be made out of lighter silk. And if you're wearing a cotta, because it's this fancier fabric, you might be considered fully dressed, even if you don't have the overdress over that. I know, it's confusing. Lots of rules. Okay, but on to that third layer. Women have a giornea, right? A feminine version of the man's giornea. So it's a sleeveless overdress that's going to be open at the sides. It's going to be elaborately embroidered or woven. It might be lined with fur, and it might be hemmed or trimmed with fur, other fine fabrics. So it's going to be open down the front and the sides so that you can see the fabric underneath it show through. So you have a giornea. Or women had a version of a choppa as well. And so it's an overgown with sleeves, right? Just like the men's. And it's going to be closing down the front and be closed down the sides. So here's an image of kind of all those layers of a summer outfit. You can see her white linen camicia just barely peeking through on that one sleeve that's slit there. She's got this kind of orange red cotta on. I'm assuming it's a cotta because it seems really lightweight, right? It has that embroidered gold thread, either embroidered or brocade floral print on it, and then she's got these detachable orange silk sleeves, and over all of that she has the giornea, right? That open side, sides opened upper layer, and then on her feet she has leather shoes. And we can't see it, but underneath all of this, we assume that she has some underwear and some stockings. We would call them braccia in Italian. So I'm going to include this in here because a lot of Italian art is drawing on mythology of Greece and Rome and also on biblical themes. So sometimes like contemporary fashion gets melded with ye olde timey fashion for the period and mixed in with a little bit of fantasy. So this is a detail from Sandro Botticelli's Primavera. And this appears to be some sort of fantasy garment that real women didn't actually wear at this time. But it kind of mimics a camicia, and it's also referencing, the ancient Greek drapery styles. But it's seen through the lens of these Renaissance artists, so it's not truly a chiton or a stola. But here is a surviving example of an Italian camicia, right? So it's white linen with all of this beautiful embroidery all over it. And here's an example of a woman wearing a linen camicia with embroidery. And so you can see that camicias were kind of meant to be seen, at least partially, hence this embroidery. And here's another one. You can see this neckline is low. The sleeves are really full, and all of this fullness is gathered into these tiny pleats and then tapered into this narrow cuff. So you can see, again, this conspicuous consumption. These may be rectangles sewn together very cleverly, right? And maybe rectangles with some triangular gussets in there, but the volume that this fabric requires to make this garment is quite a bit more than back in the early medieval period where people were trying to just eke out the most they could from their little piece of cloth. And again, here are those layers in action. You can see there's a pink brocade giornea over an ivory brocade gamura, and the sleeves on that are slashed to see the white linen camicia underneath. And you can see, right, even though her arms are crossed over her waist, the gamura is tight fitting, and then the giornea is loose and flowing. And you can see the slashing to expose that camicia, and you can see the front lacing on the gamura. And what you can't see here, you can see in the next slide or two, is that the gamura, the bodice, right, the top part of the dress is cut separately from the skirt and then stitched together. And that helps make this silhouette a little bit more body conscious. And you can see it's lacing down the front. And also to help this body conscious shaping, the bodice may be stiffened. There may be a stiffer layer of fabric sewn in between the fashion fabric and the lining to help hold its shape. So here's a cutting pattern for the gamura and two modern reproductions of those layers on a human figure. And again, so you can see how there's all these curves here. You can see the separate top and bottom of this dress, and then there's the gores for the skirt, and then a tight fitting sleeve there. But you can't really be economical with a fabric cutting this out. You're going to have a lot of leftover. And so here are some women in choppa over the gamura and the kamicia. So the choppa is more fitted than that loose and flowy jornea, right? It also has a raised waistline. The choppa may or may not have sleeves. The sleeves might be of different lengths. And it's going to be closed down the sides, and it may be open or closed down the front of that bodice as well. Here's some more style variation in choppa and gamuras. So again, you can see, right, bodice and skirt are cut separately. That allows for this tight fit through the torso. Look at these necklines, low and kind of square, and then we've got that plunging neckline of the overgown, right? And you can see that lady on the far end, or young girl, her choppa is split down the front so that you can see her underskirt, and then the lady on the left, her choppa is held closed down the front so that you can't see those underlayers. So lots of variety. And here are some women with similar and then with contrasting sleeves that are tied onto the bodice rather than sewn in place. But like, check out the volume on these sleeves, huh? And here's a nice view of a choppa from the back. So you can see what I mean when I'm talking about box pleating, and you can see how raised that waistline is. Over all of this, if they needed one, women would also wear a mantello, and like the men, it's draped over the shoulders and it might be pinned in place, but again, we don't have those big heavy clasps showing off as decorative jewelry, right? And a nice thing about the mantello and women is that you could, like the Greek women and Roman women from times past, you can drape this up over your head if you wanted to cover your head. Now, I did want to take a moment to show you these. These are existing drawers, or in Italian it would be braccia. This is a women's undergarment made of linen with a center front opening, and these, you know, are like little pantalettes that are going to go underneath all of those skirts. But look at this absolutely gorgeous embroidery here around the leg bands. It's done in metal and silk thread. So even though we have this bodycon silhouette, we're still kind of aware of modesty. So lots of times in portraits, you'll see these kind of semi-transparent linen kerchiefy things, or silk, and they're called a fazzoletto. So it's so sheer that you just might miss it sometimes, but it's a little kerchief that kind of either drapes over the bodice at the neckline or is going to be tucked into the bodice. And this is kind of from a decree from the Pope, because it required that dress necklines be no lower than 1.25 inches from the base of the neck, like that little hollow at the bottom of your throat. And of course, necklines were much lower than that. So they kind of cheated and put this little semi-sheer kerchief over their bosom line to kind of get past the dress codes. And let's talk a little bit about hairstyle and headwear for women in this period. Now, you've probably noticed the women in this period, their hair is for the large part uncovered, right? But it's kind of a half up, half down affair. So they have these rather elaborate hairstyles, right? Where the hair is, you know, down a little bit in the front, parted in the middle, and then pinned up in the back. But we've got lots of different ways to adorn the hair. and you can just kind of read through these, right? The lenza is a cord that's worn around the head like a head necklace to keep a woman's hair flat and out of her face. Or you might have something called a trinzelle, a sheer hairnet that covers the back of the head, and it might be beaded and otherwise, fancy netted, sort of like those the crispinets from the Gothic period. And then the hairstyle, this is called a coazolene, center parted and smooth to the head in a long braid at the back that then kind of get coiled up, and then ribbon and netting added to trim that out. And then you can see a balzo, which is a really kind of like bulby headdress, and you'll see this in a minute. Here's an example of that balzo. So it's kind of like the padded roll from the Gothic period and kind of like a turban. And here are some of those other hairstyles and headdress things that I mentioned. You can see the lenza, that horizontal line that's going around her head, and then the coazone in the back, which is kind of covering and coiling her braid in place. And here's a fancier lenza that looks, maybe it's metallic, and has some like jewel, decorative motifs on it. And there's the tinzale, that hairnet that's holding her coiled up hair in place. It's not to say women didn't ever wear veils on their head. Here's an example of a veiled woman, but look at how fine this fabric is. I assume it's silk, and it's so fine as to be almost invisible. And women often used false hair to create this illusion of more fullness. Now, you've probably noticed too, blonde is a pretty popular hair color amongst women in the Italian Renaissance. And if you didn't have naturally occurring blonde hair, there were different treatments to kind of bleach the hair blonder by walking out in the sun. So if you did sun-in as a teenager, like we did back in the 80s, right? You could bleach your hair to make it blonder. And here's an example of that. We assume she's a natural blonde, although who knows, right? But the hair is long and loose and back from the face. They did sometimes have rather unnaturally high hairlines. She's got this beautiful kind of classic Renaissance silhouette, an exposed neckline, big voluminous sleeves, those several layers, tight fitting at the bodice, and then a big voluminous skirt. And as you've probably seen in many of these images, right, when you have this kind of like off the, exposed neckline going on, you kind of want to accentuate that area even more. So you've been seeing a lot of necklaces, right? Here's an example of a woman in a bonnet, very similar to a man's bonnet from the same period. This slide is out of sequence, apologies for this, but you can see how this volume and fullness is gathered together in a variety of different ways, right? We've got that puffy upper sleeve and slimmer lower sleeve, mirroring the men's styles. You can see they're using ribbons and slashing and gathers and pleats and something called cartridge pleating that kind of makes those little round pleats hold all of this volume in place so you can control it. Let's spend a brief few moments talking about children's wear. And for the most part, people in the Italian Renaissance dressed their children, even at a very young age, like tiny little adults. The silhouette is the same. Oftentimes the fabrics are the same. It's just the size that's different. And you can see it here in this father and son portrait, right? Similar silhouettes, similar fabrics, similar accessories. Lastly, I want to spend a few moments talking about clothing for the not wealthy. Obviously, we don't have as many images of them, but they, of course, did exist, right? Wealth was concentrated in the top 5% of people in Italy, which meant most everybody didn't have those silk brocades and jewels and fancy hairdos, right? But you can see, right, similar silhouettes in much less expensive fabrics, linen, wool. We don't have the fancy embroidery or brocading, and the volume is a little bit less, and certainly a little less tailored. Here are a couple of more examples. You can see on the right, there's the laborer. You saw him earlier in this slideshow when I was showing you the camicia, right? And you can see his braids underneath there. And he's got his hose rolled down and kind of tied around under his kneecaps. I'm assuming it's because he's doing some strenuous physical labor, and this makes things a little bit more breezy. You can also see he's got a Farsetto on, and he's opened the Farsetto completely so that he doesn't overheat himself. And remember how I said the kind of fashionable upper class had, little facial hair. If they did, it was very neatly trimmed. This man is, kind of from the rougher peasant class, and he's got a full beard. Here are some examples of, working class women. Again, similar shapes, right? Even some similar volumes on those sleeves, but simpler fabrics. And then you can see these women are wearing aprons, which is a very practical garment because you're not going to get your clothes dirty. Your apron is going to get dirty, and it's much easier and cheaper to wash and or replace an apron than to replace your entire outfit. And here is an example of a wool and linen house dress from the mid 1500s. And as I said, it's made out of wool and linen. You can kind of see the back has been like pieced together a little bit, and the front has been kind of reserved for the best part of the fabric. And here is a detail from the Ghirlandaio painting that's the birth of John the Baptist. And so here's a servant in the back. She's a little blurry, but you can see, right? She's got that front lacing bodice. She's got her apron, but she's got her 3 layers, just like the women in the upper class. And she doesn't have all that fancy headgear on, but her hair is styled similarly. Parted in the center, coiled back from the face, and then her, because she's working, it's coiled up in a bun so it's off her neck.